The majority of PlayStation games are often very well received. Critics love them and fans do too. They're usually among the best games of the year. But in 2016, 10 years ago, PlayStation had an incredible year when it came to game announcements. They announced the return of God of War, the beginning of their newest franchise with Marvel's Spider-Man, the sequel to one of the greatest games ever made with The Last of Us Part 2, and they shocked the gaming world with one of the best trailers I have personally ever seen. The fantastic Days Gone trailer. That trailer showed what it felt like, the dream of anyone who had ever wanted to play an open world zombie game. A game with massive hordes of zombies for us to fight, and that's exactly what Days Gone promised. A game with the quality of Sony's typical AAA big budget titles where we explore an open world on our motorcycle, a world devastated by an infection. It was a dream premise, but unfortunately, even though I personally love Days Gone, it seems the game didn't quite follow the usual PlayStation Studios formula of becoming another almost universally acclaimed title. But over these last 7 years since its release, Days Gone has almost gained a cult following, a legion of fans who absolutely love the game. With every passing year, it feels like more and more people are begging for a sequel that seemingly may never come. Personally, I think it's already one of the classics of the PS4 catalog, and the more years pass, the more legendary and memorable it becomes. But as I said before, Days Gone wasn't loved by the critics. It sits at a 71 on Metacritic with a much higher user score, an 8.4 compared to the critics' 71, a difference that is, no pun intended, quite critical. And there's a reason for that. The game launched with several issues, many bugs, texture problems, ghosting, stutters, and various glitches that maybe didn't completely ruin the game, but they did break the immersion that the rest of the experience tried so hard to create. And that's something very uncommon for the big PlayStation AAA titles. At least right now, I can't recall a single PlayStation game that launched with major problems, one that had multiple bugs and glitches. The only one that really comes to mind is Days Gone. Because of the state the game launched in, that score is, unfortunately, fair. A big budget game sold at full price should already release fully optimized in every sense of the word, and because Days Gone was so different from the usual Sony quality standard, the shock was even bigger. Even though it wasn't made by one of the biggest developers, it was made by a smaller studio in scale, the price was the same and the budget was still massive. Nothing really justifies the rough launch that Days Gone had. And I understand that this lackluster release damaged the game's reputation. That makes total sense, but over the years and even today, the game is quite different. The last time I played it, I didn't encounter a single bug. With all the patches, the care that was put into the game after launch, and the fact that today you can play it on PS5 at 60 FPS or on PC with even fewer limitations, it's a very different experience from what it was back in those first days in 2019. Nowadays, it's very hard to find even a single bug, and the game has a fairly solid performance with zero stutters. So today, when looking back at the game as it exists now, not as it was 7 years ago, it's almost impossible to criticize it for its technical issues like bugs or the performance, but there are some things that still can be criticized, and for me one of them is the story overall. I'm not a huge fan of the story, but I'm not a hater either. To me, it's simply a good story. One of the biggest criticisms aimed at the story in Days Gone is its pacing. It's a very slow burn story, but while many people criticize the slow beginning, others also criticize the fact that the story stretches far too long. I really enjoy the first few hours of the game. We're settling into the world, getting to know some of the camps, exploring what is, in my opinion, the most beautiful part of the map with those forests, meeting the characters. But the game feels very different depending on which half you're in. The first big portion of the game, those early hours I mentioned, are a slow burn where you're adapting to everything, but the second half becomes extremely intense. And I'm not even talking about the story itself, but the gameplay, because it's in that second half that we finally start getting access to the big things of the game. That's when we reach the more well-equipped camps, and consequently start getting much more powerful weapons. The difference is very noticeable. That's also when our bike finally becomes properly upgraded. The entire game suddenly feels more frantic in every sense. The boss fights are harder, and the biggest selling point of the game only really appears during this half of the story, the hordes. As I said earlier, you probably remember the big Days Gone trailer, the one with the massive horde. And that trailer was so important because when Days Gone was announced as an open world game set in a post-apocalyptic world, there wasn't much that made it stand out. There were already plenty of open world zombie games, so that alone wasn't going to make it special. If it was the story, well, The Last of Us already existed, one of the greatest stories ever told in an apocalyptic world with, let's say, zombie-like creatures. In a genre as saturated as zombie games, or whatever name a developer wants to give to their infected creatures, it's very hard to do something truly new. There's just not that much left to reinvent the wheel, and that's where the iconic Days Gone trailer kicks in. The trailer that showed the game's standout feature, its biggest selling point, the gigantic, enormous hordes. The idea that we could fight hundreds of zombies at once in real time without even a single frame drop. It sounded absolutely insane. Zombies coming in from every direction, real chaos, having to think on the spot with not a single second to rest because they're attacking from everywhere. It was one of the coolest things ever promised in a game, and the truth is, it actually delivered on that promise. There really are many hordes in the game, but the problem is that we only truly start entering horde territory after more than 20 or 25 hours of gameplay. More than half of the game passes without us properly fighting a horde. It's possible to encounter them earlier, but they're much rarer before the story introduces the first one. And that's a real shame, because I can confidently say that fighting a horde in this game is one of the most intense moments I've ever experienced in any game I've played. There's a completely unique sense of desperation. After finishing a horde fight, it feels amazing, but during the fight, you're constantly searching for places to escape to. No, you can't stay there for long because they'll reach you anyway. The music that plays during the horde fights is incredibly fitting for the moment. Everything about the hordes is extremely well designed. It's so well designed that it's just sad that they aren't used earlier in the game, and that comes back to the pacing issue because the first real horde fight happens only a few hours before the end of the game. Then suddenly all the story related hordes are jammed into those final hours. Everything becomes very compact and unfortunately can even start to feel a little repetitive. But the tension never really fully disappears. That little chill you get when you know a horde is coming is always there. I will never forget the fight that we have to do in the dark, deep inside of a cave. Like, it's genuinely one of the most fun and best designed mechanics I've seen in a game in a long time. Even today, 7 years later, it's still one of the most unique mechanics I've ever experienced in a zombie game. Something I've always found fantastic is that the hordes sleep during the day and come out at night. It's not random. You can actually see the horde return to their cave when the sun starts to appear and then heading back out again during the night. It's very immersive and it's just cool to see such an interesting mechanic working like that. And it's also a shame that it's somewhat wasted. But Days Gone does this thing a lot of, it throws you into its role and basically tells you, figure it out. That happens with the hordes and the rest of the infected, but also with the other big selling point of the game, which is the bike. There are so many moments where you can run out of gas and suddenly you have to search for fuel on foot or even push the bike yourself through a forest with this overwhelming sense of like desperation because you're on foot, infected are nearby and you can't make too much noise because they'll come after you. It's something that no other zombie game really manages to replicate. It's extremely unique, a feeling you simply don't find in other games. During exploration, especially in the first half of the game, it's almost like every time you pass a corner, you're scanning the area trying to see if there's a gas station or a place where you can refuel, just so you don't get stranded in the middle of nowhere pushing your bike. That feeling brings life to the game. Throughout the whole experience, it's really cool how much you have to care about the bike. It's similar to something like Red Dead Redemption 2, where your horse is your main companion and you have to care for it. In Days Gone, it's the bike. Over the course of the game, you keep upgrading it. The engine, the tires, the gas tank so it lasts longer, visual customizations, and it's something really satisfying to slowly improve over time. But the system never goes so deep that it becomes annoying. It has just enough depth to feel rewarding, and the gameplay itself is honestly one of the most satisfying vehicle experiences I've had in a game that isn't specifically about racing racing or something like that. The sound, the controls, riding the bike just feels perfect. It's incredibly easy to stop playing the game for a long time and then come back and immediately feel comfortable with it again. The whole game is heavily inspired by biker culture, which isn't something I personally love that much, but the gameplay with the bike is something I could easily spend hours doing. It's extremely well designed, and during the marketing of the game, those were the two biggest selling points. The things that made it stand out from everything else, the hordes and the bike. Even years after the game released, those are still the two aspects that personally stand out the most, because the story itself is much simpler and in some ways a bit more cliche than something extremely detailed and rich, especially when you compare it to typical narrative level of PlayStation games like The Last of Us. It's a much safer story. It's more of a popcorn story, something that happens and is fun while it's happening, but not something that will be memorable or something that becomes better with time. It's just good and that's it. Deacon St. John, the main character, is a good character. Personally, I like him a lot, and I think his motivations are interesting enough that you can connect with him throughout the game. But the story lacks risk, it lacks real high stakes. There are many moments where it feels like a character might suffer real consequences, but in the end, everything turns out fine. The story sometimes builds tension, but doesn't quite have the courage to fully commit to certain decisions. It also relies on quite a few cliche narrative choices, which makes it difficult for it to ever become something truly extraordinary. It's more like a 7 out of 10 story, maybe a 7.5, but when you combine that story with everything else the game does, it becomes much more interesting. And honestly, the story is one of the easiest things that could be improved in a sequel. Those are very fixable issues that could easily be refined in a potential Days Gone 2. And that sequel was actually pitched at one point, but it never even entered development. A big narrative started spreading that the game simply hadn't performed well enough, that it didn't sell enough to justify a sequel, which is utterly ridiculous. The game sold more than 9 million copies on PlayStation and another million on Steam. And that was in 2022. By now, it's probably around 11 million copies sold in total, which is an extremely high number, especially for a brand new IP created by a studio that isn't one of Sony's biggest developers. A whole narrative formed around the idea that Days Gone didn't sell well, and therefore wouldn't get a sequel. But if you actually look at the numbers, that simply isn't true. Games like Ghost of Tsushima that sold at a very similar level, maybe even less, still received a sequel. So why was Days Gone forgotten? The answer is a bit more complicated than just saying it didn't sell well enough. The real issue is that the game wasn't universally loved. It didn't generate the kind of discourse about dominating awards or being massive critical success like many PlayStation Studios games had been in previous years. That rough launch ended up damaging its reputation so much that Sony simply wasn't interested in returning to it again, even though it was commercially successful. Over the years, Days Gone has increasingly gained the reputation of being the most underrated PlayStation game, and it's been called underrated so many times that nowadays I don't even like to call it that. I prefer calling it underappreciated because that's really what it is. I really like Days Gone, but the game absolutely has its flaws. The open world, for example, is one of the most beautiful ones I've ever seen. The map is incredibly detailed, with different environments in many areas that are genuinely breathtaking. Each region of the game has the perfect atmosphere to make you feel like this is a world taken over by an infection. There's always that sense that no matter where you are, an infected could appear out of nowhere. But despite all of its strengths, the world does fall into that trap of repetition. There's a lot to do, but very little that truly stands out. Most of the side missions are fairly repetitive fetch quests, and the activities throughout the game don't evolve that much over time. Still, the game does a great job of using the open world for environmental storytelling, and that aspect works really well. Days Gone has many positives. It offers one of the most unique and interesting systems ever seen in zombie games. It's just a shame that the game didn't receive the defense it deserved during its early days after launch, because it's one of those games that maybe wasn't top tier at first, but could have become something truly great through sequels. Days Gone suffered from the fact that at that time a lot of people almost wanted to hate it. The narrative became something like, it's just another typical Sony game, except this time it launched badly and it received a lot of unnecessary hate. But over the time it kept gaining more and more popularity, and that popularity is deserved. It's not one of those games that needs to be a complete masterpiece, a flawless game. No, it just needs to be good, and I truly believe Days Gone is great. Even when trying to defend the game, you can still clearly see many of its flaws, and some people look at those flaws and treat the entire game as a complete failure. It's true that the game had a bad launch and it deserves criticism for that, but at its core, it's something good that deserves your time. Nowadays, people look so much at those 10 out of 10 games, the ones that maybe release once or twice a year, and expect every game to be like that. That's never going to happen. Days Gone isn't perfect. It never was and never will be, but just because 10 out of 10 games exist doesn't mean that there isn't space for the 7s and 8s out of 10. Those games still have a huge place in the gaming world and deserve praise even if they're not the perfection we sometimes expect them to be. Days Gone is a game that becomes more iconic with time, more defined by what it could have become. Not necessarily by the game itself, but by the sequel that never happened. By the almost urban legend of wanting a Days Gone 2. It's a shame, but unfortunately I think that will never happen unless a miracle occurs and Sony suddenly decides to bring this franchise back. But anyway, even though it isn't something like The Last of Us, God of War, Uncharted, Days Gone still deserves your attention even 7 years after the terrible launch it had. Let me know what you think about Days Gone. Do you feel the same way I do? Do you also love the game? I have a lot of affection for it and I'd love to know if you share that same opinion. And also tell me if you think there's any other game at this level that never got the sequel but it definitely deserved one. I'm curious. Leave a like if you want to, subscribe, you know what to do, and as always, thank you so much for watching.